My world was a sterile, predictable environment of controlled variables and predictable outcomes. As Dr. Julian Thorne, I was one of the top cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, a master of the human heart in every way, except the one that mattered to most people. Feelings were messy, inefficient variables. Love was a complication I had no interest in diagnosing, let alone contracting. My heart was a pump, a brilliant, intricate machine, and I treated it as such, in my patients and in myself. The letter from my late father's estate lawyer was an unwelcome disruption. It was written in cold, legal language that I could appreciate, but its contents were anything but logical. A clause in his will, a final posthumous chess move from a man who always thought he knew best. To inherit my controlling shares in the hospital, to secure the board seat that was rightfully mine, I had to be married by my 38th birthday. It was archaic, insulting, and utterly binding. Failure was not an option. So I approached the problem as I would any complex surgical case. I identified the objective, assessed the variables, and selected the most efficient instrument for the job. The instrument, in this case, was Ilara Vance. I remembered her as a child, the daughter of a talented but financially hapless artist my father had once patronized. Now, she was a young woman in her early 20s, an art student drowning in debt, with a quiet resilience in her dark, expressive eyes. She was the perfect solution. She needed financial security. I needed a wife. It was a clean, symbiotic transaction. Our first meeting to discuss the proposal was in a sterile coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and disinfectant. She sat opposite me, clutching her worn sketchbook to her chest like a shield. "It's a contract, Ms. Vance," I stated, pushing the folder across the table. My voice was flat, the same one I used to deliver a difficult prognosis. "A mutually beneficial arrangement. You would be free of all your debts. Your family would be secure. You would live in my penthouse, want for nothing. In return, you would perform the social duties of a wife for a period of 1 year. After that, we part ways, amicably, and with a generous settlement for you." She didn't open the folder. Her eyes, the color of rich, dark earth, searched mine for something I knew she wouldn't find. "And love?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I almost scoffed. "Love is not a term of this agreement. This is about practicality, not passion." She was silent for a long time, her gaze drifting to the window, to the blur of people living their messy, emotional lives. I could see the conflict warring within her pragmatism versus her soul. In the end, pragmatism won. It always does. "I agree," she said, her voice firm, betraying the slight tremble in her hands. Our wedding was at a courthouse. The air was stale with the ghosts of 1,000 other hurried vows. Ilara wore a simple white dress that looked out of place in the drab, beige room. I wore a suit. We exchanged rings, cold, heavy bands of platinum that felt more like handcuffs than symbols of unity. There was no family, no friends, just 2 witnesses plucked from a waiting room and a justice of the peace who looked profoundly bored. When he said, "You may kiss the bride," I hesitated. It wasn't in the contract. Ilara met my gaze, her expression unreadable. I leaned in and brushed my lips against her cheek. Her skin was soft, and for a fraction of a second, I smelled lavender and charcoal pencils. It was a data point, nothing more. My penthouse was like an extension of my operating theatre. Minimalist, cold, and meticulously organized. White walls, chrome fixtures, glass tables. It was a space designed to be observed, not lived in. Ilara stood in the center of the vast living room, her small suitcase looking like a child's toy in the cavernous space. "Your room is the second door on the left," I said, loosening my tie. "Mine is at the end of the hall. We will maintain separate spaces. For appearances, we will need to project an image of compatibility, but within these walls, we live our own lives." She just nodded, her eyes taking in the sterile perfection of it all. "It's very clean," she murmured. That night, I retreated to my study, immersing myself in the familiar comfort of medical journals. But I was aware of her. I could hear the soft creak of floorboards as she moved through the apartment, the quiet rush of water from her shower. She was a foreign organism introduced into my controlled environment, and my every instinct was to observe, classify, and contain her. I told myself it was a minor inconvenience, a temporary variable. In 1 year, my life, my hospital, my perfectly ordered world would be mine. It was a simple, elegant solution. I felt nothing for the woman now living under my roof, and that was exactly how I intended to keep it. The days settled into a strange, sterile rhythm. I would leave for the hospital before dawn and return long after sunset. Ilara was a ghost in my home. The only evidence of her existence were small, subtle changes I found deeply unsettling. A brightly coloured mug left on the kitchen counter, an art history book on the glass coffee table, the faint scent of her lavender and charcoal scent lingering in the hallway. Each one was a minor infraction against the sterile order of my life, and each one pricked at my composure. At the hospital, I was in my element. The heart of a 60-year-old man, a failing aortic valve, was in my hands. This was a world that made sense. Scalpel, sutures, the steady beep of the heart monitor. Here, I was in absolute control. Dr. Thorne, your precision is almost inhuman, Dr. Lena Petrova remarked as we scrubbed out after the successful surgery. Lena was a brilliant neurologist, sharp-tongued and observant. Too observant. Inhumanity is a prerequisite for this job. Wouldn't you say, Lena? I retorted, drying my hands. Is it? Or is that just the excuse you use to avoid having a life? She fired back, her green eyes challenging me. I heard you got married. I should be surprised, but given the board meeting next week, the timing seems surgically precise. I gave her a cold stare. My personal life is not a topic for professional discussion. Of course not, she said with a wry smile. Because you don't have one. You have a series of strategic maneuvers. I ignored her and walked away, her words echoing in my mind. She was right, of course. That's what made it so irritating. My current obsession was the case of a young boy named Leo, only 10 years old, with a congenital heart defect so rare it was practically theoretical. Arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy. His heart's muscle tissue was slowly being replaced by fibrous, fatty tissue, turning the organ into a ticking time bomb. Every surgeon who had looked at his chart had called him inoperable, but I saw it as the ultimate challenge, a puzzle only I could solve. I spent my nights buried in research, mapping out a radical, multi-stage surgical approach that had never been attempted. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the turning of pages. One night I felt a presence and looked up. Ilara was standing in the doorway of my study, holding a tray. I thought you might be hungry, she said softly. You haven't eaten. On the tray was a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a breach of protocol. I don't require assistance, I said curtly, my eyes not leaving the medical diagram on my desk. You're not a machine, Julian, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. You're a man, and men need to eat. She placed the tray on the edge of my desk, a small island of warmth and colour in my monochromatic world. The aroma of the soup, something with herbs and vegetables, was distracting. I didn't thank her. I just watched as she retreated, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. I didn't touch the food. But hours later, when the chill of the apartment had seeped into my bones, I found myself eating the soup. It was warm, and it tasted real. Ilara started to paint. She set up a canvas in the guest room, and the sterile air began to fill with the smell of turpentine and oil paints. Sometimes, I'd walk past her open door and see her standing there, lost in her work, a smudge of cobalt blue on her cheek. She was creating life and colour and chaos in a space I had designed for its absence. One afternoon, she showed up at the hospital. I was in my office, reviewing Leo's latest scans. when I heard a soft knock. I looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and saw her standing there, holding a paper bag. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, offering a small, hesitant smile. "I brought you a sandwich." I felt a surge of irrational anger. "This is my place of work, Ilara. It is not a place for domestic visits." The hurt in her eyes was immediate and sharp. She flinched as if I'd physically struck her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hand lowering. I thought..." Before I could say anything else, a code blue blared over the intercom. Leo. His heart was failing. I ran from the office without a backward glance, leaving her standing there in the hallway, clutching a sandwich. We managed to stabilize him, but it was a close call. The event had accelerated the damage. His time was running out. My experimental surgery was no longer a theoretical option. It was his only chance. I spent the next 48 hours at the hospital, sleeping in my office, pushing my team and myself to the absolute limit. When I finally stumbled back to the penthouse, exhausted and running on caffeine and adrenaline, I found the living room transformed. The cold glass table was gone, replaced by a warm wooden one. There were books on the shelves, a soft throw blanket draped over the stark white sofa, and a large abstract painting on the wall. A swirl of deep blues, fiery oranges, and hopeful yellows. It was vibrant and alive and emotional. It was everything my world was not. Ilara was asleep on the sofa, curled up under the blanket, a sketchbook resting on her lap. I stood there for a long time, just watching her. She was so young, so full of a life I didn't understand. She had signed up for a business arrangement, and in return, I treated her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, stirred in my chest. It was an unfamiliar, unwelcome sensation. I carefully picked up her sketchbook. It was filled with charcoal drawings of the city, of flowers, of people in the park. And then I saw it. A sketch of me, hunched over my desk, the lamplight casting deep shadows on my face. She hadn't drawn me as a monster or a cold, arrogant surgeon. She had drawn me as tired, lonely. I closed the book and gently placed it beside her. The painting on the wall seemed to mock the sterile emptiness of my life. She was filling my home with color, with life, while I was trying my best to keep it at bay. I walked to my room. The image of her asleep on the sofa burned into my mind. The controlled variables of my experiment were becoming increasingly chaotic. And the most unsettling part was, for the first time in my life, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to contain them. The morning of Leo's surgery was tense. The air in the operating theatre crackled with a mixture of anxiety and intense focus. My team moved with practiced efficiency, their trust in me absolute. I felt it too, that familiar, cold confidence. This was my domain. The boy on the table was not a child. He was a machine with a failing component, and I was the only one who could fix him. "Scalpel," I commanded, my voice steady. The first incision was clean, precise. Everything was proceeding as planned. My radical approach was working. We bypassed the heart, the steady whoosh of the machine filling the room, a mechanical replacement for the life we were trying to save. Every move was calculated, every suture placed with microscopic accuracy. Hours bled into one another. The procedure was more complex than even I had anticipated. The damaged tissue was extensive, a fragile web I had to navigate without tearing. My focus narrowed to a single point, the tip of my forceps, the delicate dance of the needle. The rest of a world ceased to exist. There was only the boy's heart and my hands. Then, something shifted. A subtle change in the energy of the room. I glanced up at the observation gallery above us. It was usually empty during these long procedures, save for the occasional medical student. But today, someone was there. It was Ilara. She stood with her hands pressed against the glass, her face a pale oval of concern. Our eyes met through the thick pain. In her gaze, I didn't see the wife of a brilliant surgeon. I saw a young woman looking at a sick little boy, her heart aching for him. She wasn't watching a medical miracle. She was witnessing a fight for a child's life. And in that moment, the sterile field of my focus shattered. Suddenly, the boy on the table was not a machine. He was Leo, a 10-year-old child who loved comic books and wanted to play soccer again. The heart in my hands was not a component. It was the center of his universe, the vessel of his hopes and his parents' dreams. A wave of something hot and terrifying washed over me. Fear. It was raw, primal, and completely alien to me in this room. My hands, which had been so steady moments before, felt clumsy, heavy. The complex web of tissue in front of me no longer looked like a puzzle to be solved, but a life that could be extinguished by a single miscalculation. "Doctor!" My resident's voice cut through the fog. "Your vitals are dropping." I looked at the monitor. He was right. The boy's heart, even on bypass, was becoming unstable. The stress of the procedure was too much. An alarm began to beep, a shrill, insistent cry of impending failure. My mind raced, cycling through protocols, through every textbook solution. Nothing fit. My plan, my perfect, calculated plan, was failing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep in. For the first time in my career, I was lost. My eyes flicked back up to the gallery. Elara was still there, her expression now laced with fear for me. She saw me faltering. She saw the man, not the surgical god. And seeing myself through her eyes, I saw it too. The arrogance, the coldness, the belief that I could control life and death with nothing but logic. My logic was failing. So I did something I had never done. I let it go. I closed my eyes for a single, terrifying second and listened. Not to the monitors, not to my team, but to an instinct I had long suppressed. A whisper of intuition. A different path, a riskier one. A maneuver not found in any journal presented itself in my mind. It was a leap of faith, a desperate, unscientific guess. "Give me the 10 blade, I said, my voice hoarse. "And prepare the defibrillator. We're going to try something else." My team stared at me, their faces a mask of confusion and concern. This was not the plan. This was improvisation. This was chaos. But in my gut, in some forgotten part of my own heart, I knew it was the only way. I looked up at Elara one last time, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. Then I lowered my gaze and began to cut. The hours that followed were a blur of adrenaline and instinct. The risky maneuver worked. We shocked Leo's heart back into a steady rhythm, the crisis averted. The rest of the surgery was completed on muscle memory, my mind still reeling from the chasm that had opened up within me. When I finally closed the last suture, the exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. It was a success. I had saved him, but I felt no triumph, only a profound, hollow emptiness. I left the OR without a word to my team, stripping off my scrubs and walking out of the hospital into the cold, pre-dawn air. The city was quiet, the sky a bruised purple. I didn't go home. I couldn't face Elara. Couldn't face the questions in her eyes that I had no answers for. I walked for hours, the sterile smell of the hospital clinging to me. For my entire life, I had built walls of logic and ambition around myself. I had believed that control was strength, that emotion was a fatal weakness. In the OR, Elara's presence, her simple human empathy, had breached those walls effortlessly. She had shown me what I had become, a brilliant technician, but an empty man. The realization didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like a diagnosis for a terminal illness. I found myself sitting on a bench in a deserted park as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the grass. "I figured I might find you here." Lena's voice startled me. She sat down beside me, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "The team said you just walked out," she said. "They're calling it a miracle." What you did in there, Julian, it was legendary. But you don't look like a man who just made history. I feel like a fraud, I confessed, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Why? Because for a second, you were human, she countered. I was watching from the control room. I saw you look up at her. I saw you change. You didn't save that boy with just your hands today, Julian. You saved him with your heart. Maybe it's time you stopped treating it like a liability. Her words hung in the air between us. She was right. I had spent so long dissecting the organ, I had forgotten its purpose. When I finally returned to the penthouse, the sun was high in the sky. The apartment was quiet. The painting on the wall, Elara's painting, seemed to pulse with a life I couldn't comprehend. I walked past the guest room, her room, and saw that the door was ajar. And then I saw it, her suitcase open on the bed. She was packing. My own heart, the one I had ignored for so long, gave a painful, violent lurch. She turned as I entered the room, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes were puffy, but she was composed. The surgery was a success, I heard, she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. Congratulations, you've proven your point. You'll have no trouble securing your board seat now. What are you doing? I asked, my voice strained. I'm upholding my end of the bargain, she said, folding a sweater and placing it in the suitcase. The contract was for 1 year, but the objective has been met. There's no reason for me to stay. This was a transaction, Julian, a service I provided, and the service is no longer required. Each word was a precise, clean cut, excising me from her life. She was using my own logic, my own cold, transactional language against me. This is not a transaction, I said, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. She finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw anger in her eyes, a deep, sorrowful anger. Don't you dare, she said, her voice trembling. Don't you dare say that now. For months, I have been a ghost in your home, an item in a contract. I tried to be more. I tried to see the man behind the surgeon, but all you ever saw was a variable. I deserve more than that, Julian. I deserve more than to be a solution to a problem. I deserve to be loved, not as a complication, but as a person. She turned back to her suitcase, a clear dismissal. The finality of it was suffocating. She was leaving. She was taking her colors, her warmth, her quiet strength, and she was going to walk out of my life, leaving me in the sterile grey world I had built for myself. And the thought of that silence, of that emptiness returning, was more terrifying than any medical emergency I had ever faced. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed. My mind, the organ I had always trusted, was screaming at me with cold, hard logic. It told me to let her go. She was right. The arrangement was complete. Her departure was the final, logical step in our agreement. It was the clean, efficient outcome. But my heart, the treacherous, unfamiliar muscle in my chest, was screaming something else entirely. It was a chaotic, incoherent roar of protest. Don't, I heard myself say. The word was quiet, but it stopped her hand mid-fold. She didn't turn around. Don't what, Julian? Don't leave. Why? So you can have a living ghost to prove to your colleagues that you're capable of a relationship. The pretense is over. It's not a pretense, I said, stepping into the room. I walked around the bed until I was standing in front of her, forcing her to look at me. Not anymore. I looked into her eyes, those dark, expressive eyes that had seen the loneliness in me I hadn't even admitted to myself. You are right, I began, my voice raw. About everything. I am selfish. I am arrogant. I saw you as a solution, an instrument. I have spent my entire life reducing the world to a series of equations I could solve and control. I built a fortress of logic and hid inside it because I was a coward. The confession hung in the air, a truth so stark it felt like it had physical weight. Yesterday, in that operating room, I continued, my voice cracking slightly. I looked up, and I saw you. And for the first time, I didn't see a variable. I saw light. And then I looked down at that little boy, and all of my equations, all of my certainties, they crumbled into dust. I was terrified. And in that terror, for the first time, I felt something real. Tears were now silently streaming down her face. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just listening. "I don't know what love is, Ilara," I said, the admission costing me more than any professional failure ever could. "The very concept is foreign to me. I wouldn't know how to recognize it. I wouldn't know how to give it. Everything you said about me is true. But what I do know is that when I saw you packing that suitcase, the thought of this apartment, of my life, without your colors, without your charcoal smudges, without you, it felt like a fatal prognosis, an emptiness I cannot survive." I reached out and, my hand trembling, gently touched her cheek, wiping away a tear with my thumb. Her skin was warm, alive. "I'm not asking you to stay based on our contract," I whispered. "That contract is void. I'm asking, no, I'm begging you to stay and teach me. Teach me how to see the colors. Teach me how to be a man, not just a surgeon. Let me start over, with you, for real this time." She searched my eyes, looking for the deception, the calculation she was so used to seeing. But there was none left, only a terrifying, desperate sincerity. She leaned into my hand, a small, almost imperceptible movement that felt like the entire world shifting on its axis. "Okay, Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Okay, we can start over." I closed my eyes, a wave of relief so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I didn't kiss her. It wasn't the time for a grand romantic gesture. It was a moment far more intimate than that. It was the first fragile beat of a heart learning to live. For the first time, my world was not a sterile, predictable environment. It was messy and uncertain and terrifying. And standing there, with Ilara's hand in mine, I knew I never wanted it to be clean again. What did you think of Julian's journey? Could you forgive him if you were in Ilara's place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and feedback mean the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more medical romance stories every week. Your support helps us create more content just like this.